So tonight we talk about a very unique individual. I would say one of the most remarkable rabbis in the last century. And he's the father of a much more famous rabbi who was the Lubavitcher Rebbe. So Rabbi Levi Yitzchak Schneerson was the Rebbe's father and was born in 1878, spring Passover really of 1878. So if we looked here, we would see the Rebbe and his father in two pictures side by side. So that's the Rebbe, the last Lubavitcher Rebbe, and his father in relatively later in life. And that's just a note that the Rebbe had edited about a press release regarding the passing of his father. So Rabbi Levi Yitzchak, the Rebbe's father, was the great-great-grandson of this individual who was the Tzemach Tzedek, the third Lubavitcher Rebbe. The third Lubavitcher Rebbe was the grandson of the first Rebbe, had many sons, and most of them became Rebbes themselves after his passing, but the oldest one did not. The oldest one later had a son and grandson until the great-great-grandson, who was Rabbi Levi Yitzchak, the Rebbe's father. So that's the basic family story. Now the Rebbe, the Rebbe actually was born in the town of, the town of Nikolaev in Ukraine, which is where his mother was from, and his grandfather, his maternal grandfather, was the rabbi there. And when Rabbi Levi Yitzchak married Rebbetzin Chana, the Rebbe's mother, they settled in Nikolaev too. That lasted till 1909, when Rabbi Levi Yitzchak was hired as the rabbi in this new Pirovskaya, I don't know how to pronounce it, synagogue in Yekaterinoslav, which is today known as Dnepropetrovsk in southern Ukraine. So really it's important for us to understand as well how important of a city Yekaterinoslav was at that time. In general for the Ukraine and in the Jewish sense, it was a very large Jewish center. It was a Jewish center throughout the challenging periods that followed, which is of course World War I and many refugees, and the Russian Civil War and Revolution, and the communist times. The story of the life of Rabbi Levi Yitzchak and the story of his rabbinic leadership in this city throughout the 30-some years until he was ultimately imprisoned by the communists is a story of self-sacrifice and a story of determination, a story of persevering despite the odds. And really, it's maybe best expressed by this particular individual story of how he stood up to the authorities when it came to preparing proper kosher matzah for Passover. And we can actually hear the Rebbe say the story and get the full picture. Let's see here.
Как уже я рассказал в прошлый раз, что случилось с моим отцом, что он был раввином в УССР и главным раввином в городе Днепропетровске, который был одним из главных городов всей Украины, который поставлял зерно, пшеницу для большой части России, и когда приходило время приготовить муку для мацы, приезжали со всей УССР на Украину закупать пшеницу. И так как в этом нуждались для Пасхи, то они хотели иметь хехшер, удостоверение от главного раввина, что это кошерно для Пасхи. Когда пришли к нему и сказали обо всем этом, так отец ответил, что он с большой радостью возьмет на себя эту обязанность, но с одним условием, которое само собой понятно, что если он даст удостоверение, что это кошерно для Песах, он должен быть убежден через то, что он поставит своих машгихим, и они будут наблюдать, что пшеницу, которая будет перемелена на муку, да кошерная, без воды, и также весь перемол, меление муки будет также без воды. И что тогда, когда не примешивает воду, тогда получается меньше муки, и получается более комплицировано, и это связано с большими расходами. Тогда к нему пришли от управления губернии города, где он был главным раввином, и сказали, что он саботажник и хочет ввести правительство в дефицит, чтобы они истратили много тысяч рублей для того, чтобы это было кошерное. Так он им ответил, что согласно Конституции и согласно его совести, и согласно совести каждого нормального человека, если он дает удостоверение, что это кошерно, он должен быть убежден в этом. И никто не может его заставить, чтобы он писал то, что против его совести, что не правда, стопроцентная ложь. Тогда ему предложили, чтобы он поехал в Москву, и там говорил с президентом Калининым, который был тогда, или с его представителем, и ему изложил все его соображения, что несмотря на то, что это обойдется мельницам, которые все были под правительственным управлением, обойдется им в сотни тысяч рублей, так нельзя заставить еврея, чтобы он ел мацу, которая не кошерна, и обмануть его. Говорят, что правительство говорит, что это нужно солгать и сказать, что это кошерно, хотя они знают, что это не кошерно. И когда он изложил все эти доводы в Москве, он получил официальное разрешение. И не только разрешение, но было также указание по всей Украине, что во всех тех местах, которые раввин Шнеерсон пошлет своих представителей, дать удостоверение, что это кошерная мука. Им все содействовали, помогали, даже если это будет связано с расходами, и не с там расходами, но с большими расходами. И так это было сделано и проведено по всей Украине. И, как я сказал прежде, что это еще одно доказательство, что когда доводит положение, описывает, как оно в действительности, что еврей хочет воспитывать своих детей согласно его убеждениям, и что он хочет соблюдать субботу и соблюдать Пасху как следует, тогда, если только обращаются к настоящим властям там, они не только не препятствуют, но указывают милиции и всем властям по местам, чтобы они не только не мешали, но охраняли, чтобы другие не мешали евреям вести ежедневную жизнь по-еврейски.
So it's hard for us to imagine what it must have meant to tell the local authorities in the 1920s or 30s that no, I will not cooperate and just sign off on whatever you say. if you want me to sign off on the wheat as kosher so that it sells better, it actually needs to be that way, and I'm actually going to certify it and make sure everything is upheld. But with self-sacrifice and perseverance, he was able to prevail and actually have it instituted in the proper way. Of course, teaching us the lesson not only of his own strength and commitment, but what we can do when we don't waver and we remain committed to actually doing it right. Of course, ultimately, the communists and their secret police and all of that had enough of this rabbi, who in the meantime had become the chief rabbi of Yekaterinoslav, who was so committed to strengthening the Jewish practice and really fighting back against their efforts to extinguish Judaism, that they finally had him imprisoned. And we can find out that story as we move on.
March 28th, 1939, 3 a.m. 4 NKVD agents enter Rabbi Levi Yitzchak and Chana Schneerson's home in Yekaterinoslav, a bustling industrial city in south-central Ukraine, brandishing a warrant for search and arrest. His crime? The bolstering of Judaism in the Soviet Union. In 1909, when Rabbi Levi Yitzchak arrived in Yekaterinoslav to assume the position of chief rabbi, he charmed the cosmopolitan population with his commitment to tradition and scholarly brilliance on the one hand, and his sophistication and warmth on the other. But his refusal to bend before the dictates of the new regime cost him his freedom and his life. For 5 years, he languished in exile in the inhospitable village of Khili, Kazakhstan. Weakened and ill upon his release, he returned his soul to his maker in Almaty, Kazakhstan, on the 20th of Av, 1944. Through all this deprivation, Rabbi Levi Yitzchak found solace in one place: his writing. His pages seethed with erudition, creativity, and improbable intersections between the mystical and legal realms of Torah. Yet his writing is not just an intellectual triumph. It is also a triumph of the spirit. In exile, bereft of conventional paper and ink, Rabbi Levi Yitzchak crammed his notes in the margins of his books, using ink that his wife made from locally grown berries. Tragically, most of his manuscripts were lost during those tumultuous years. Whatever was salvaged was brought to Rabbi Levi Yitzchak's son, the Rebbe in New York. These surviving works were published as a 5-volume set entitled Likutei Levi Yitzchak.
All right, so we've got, obviously, in brief, the story of his ultimate arrest in 1939 led to his passing 5 years later, shortly after he was technically released from exile, where they exiled him to in Kazakhstan, but he never did recover from everything he went through and passed on very shortly thereafter. We also saw the story of his manuscripts. He was constantly writing his brilliant ideas in Torah scholarship, and how he had no paper and no ink, and his wife managed to create ink from herbs and local berries, cooking them up in water and trying to create something. And he wrote his comments in the margins of his books. Of course, as we've seen, these were later published. But what was so unique about his writings? What makes his scholarship so special? We've seen what made his personality so unique. What made his scholarship really stand out? And we can really nail it when we understand the idea of everything in the Torah and every part of Jewish teachings in the Torah in really having more than one way to be defined. Hi, Alex. In other words, there are really 4 different ways, 4 different general approaches we can take to any particular Torah teaching, any particular even word or statement in the Torah. Let's bring up another slide to go through that. Pardes, which literally means orchard, is an acronym for the different ways we can interpret the Torah. So the pay for like a P sound will give us pshat. Pshat means the definition, the basic meaning. The R for the remez, the resh, is alluding to something. Drash is when we expound. And finally, samach for sod, which is the secret. Let's spell that out. Pshat means the simple literal meaning. Whatever the word says and means on its basic level, that's the story. Remez is allusions that the text might be hinting to. It's a godly text, the text of the Torah, and it means something more than the surface. Drash means to interpret or homiletically interpret the words, and it often is a halachic interpretation based on certain rules or other ways of reinterpreting the same words to mean something additional. And finally, sod is the secret, which means the mystical, esoteric meaning of the text, the Kabbalistic, spiritual definition of those same words. So these are four ways we can approach anything in the Torah. And to illustrate this, let's look at Shema Yisrael. So Shema is the most basic Jewish prayer where we say, Hear, O Israel, God is one. What does the word Shema mean? Shema, this first word, in terms of Pshat, Remez, Drush, and Sod, it can be interpreted in any or all of these four ways. Shema means to listen. Literally, we say, Hear, O Israel, listen. That's what the word means. But Shema in Remez is an acronym for Se'u Marom Enechem. The three letters that make up the word Shema spell out Se'u Marom Enechem, which means lift high your eyes, look upwards, look towards God, find God's presence. So that's not the literal meaning of the word. Literal meaning of the word is to listen. But Se'u Marom Enechem, lift your eyes up high and see something beyond. Drash means that Shema is listen in any language that you understand. This is what the Talmud says, that the word Shema means to listen, and then that would mean to listen however you can listen in any language. In other words, it is okay and even appropriate to say Shema in whatever language you understand. That's an additional meaning for the same word. And finally, Sod, the Kabbalistic understanding of Shema, is that the word Shema is made up of Sham Ayin. Sham, the first part of the word, means there, which indicates something that's far away, distant, not connected, not expressing God's presence, something perhaps negative and not okay. And our job is to transform that into shame, into expression of God, where we see something in this world which seems to be distant, not connected, not associated, not a good thing, and our job is to find the goodness in it. So this is really just an example of how the same word Shema has these four different interpretations that are all correct. In other words, on four different dimensions of reading the same word. You can read it literally, and it means to listen. You can read what's alluded to it by its acronym. You can read the drash, the way you expound the word to teach you the laws behind it. And finally, you can discuss the mystical component of this word. Now, each of those are typically looked at as a separate, independent part of Torah study. I can be doing pshat, I can be doing literal study of the Torah. I'll read the words, I'll translate them, explain them, take them at basically face value. I can be doing another form of interpretation. And typically we look at these as separate ways to read the Torah. If I'm looking for the legal application or the basic definition of the story or some deeper meaning. What was so unique about Rabbi Levi Yitzchak was the way his scholarship and his writings and his teachings blend all of these ideas together, where he'll take the literal meaning of a word and translate that, apply it, but also show us how that corresponds and works together with its mystical meaning, its the allusions within the word, and whatever we can give as drash, we can expound in the word. Or the same is for not just a word, but a full statement or mitzvah or idea in the Torah. Everything in the Torah, having these four types of definitions, they really all work together and form one complete whole. And we'll see a kind of example of how he's digging deep within the Torah and giving us from all these four components as one. This is a beautiful interpretation in and of itself. These are from the writings that survived Rabbi Levi Yitzchak's exile. The first letter of the Torah is a bet for Bereshit. So the Torah starts with the word Bereshit in the beginning, and that begins with the B with the letter bet. The last letter of the Torah is a lamed for Yisrael. These two letters spell the Hebrew words lev, heart, and baal, don't. This alludes to the following: the Torah must be fulfilled with a complete heart and with restraint. Let's look at what that means. Let's break this up. The Torah begins with this word, this line, Bereshit bara Elokim, in the beginning of God's creation of the heavens and the earth, starting with the letter bet right here. The Torah concludes with these words, Le'ene kol Yisrael, before the eyes of all Israel, ending with that highlighted letter you see here, Lamed. So bet and Lamed are the first and last letter of the Torah. What does that mean? Well, these two letters can spell out two different words. If you organize them in this order, bet and lamed, as you see here, that will spell out Baal, which means no or do not, don't, a negative, restriction. The same two letters, however, when you write lamed and bet, in this order, spell out lev, which would be the heart. Lev, heart. And here is where Rabbi Levi Yitzchak tells us that this is a message of how we approach the Torah. We have to approach the Torah with all our heart, and together with that, with restraint, there's something that we do not do. What is it that we do not do? So he goes on to explain. If you want to serve God with all your heart, be careful to bow, to avoid, don't make the following mistakes. So again, the first letter and last letter of the Torah spell out these two words, and we're going to combine these two words to work together in the message that it teaches us. Here, the Torah tells us, be careful to do precisely as God your God instructs you, veer neither to the right nor to the left. Says Rabbi Levi Yitzchak, this is your admonition. This is your baal. This is your don't. Don't turn right and don't turn left. What would that mean? Well, if you have bet and lamed, these two letters that spelled out the beginning and end of the Torah, you might be tempted to veer to the right. Veering to the right would mean to replace that bet with the letter to the right of it, the first letter of the Aleph bet, and to replace that lamed with the letter to the right of it, the chaf, that precedes the lamed. That would spell out the word ach. Ach means however, or in other words, a limitation, a reduction. It's when you say yes, but, when you reduce something. So if we would turn from the bet and the lamed, which are the first and last letter of the Torah, to the right, we would get ach for however. What happens when we turn to the left? When you turn from the bet and the lamed to the left, you get gimel and mem, the letters immediately after bet and lamed. Gimel and mem spells the word gam, which means in addition. But the Torah tells us, do not veer neither to the right nor to the left. What's wrong with however and in addition? what you see here. Lev, to serve God with a complete heart, requires Baal, don't detract from the Torah, which would be the Ach, and don't Gam, add to the Torah. The Torah should be neither detracted from nor added to, which this is the mitzvah that we have.
Mr. Israel.
Oops. This is the mitzvah that we have, that we know that we cannot, not only we cannot detract and reduce mitzvahs of the Torah, we also cannot add to the mitzvahs of the Torah. Now, this is a little bit complicated. I agree. But what we just did is see how Rabbi Levi Yitzchak took the first letter and the last letter of the Torah, which don't necessarily need to have any meaning at all. The first letter is part of the first word. The last letter is part of the last word. It's all fine the way it is. But taking that first letter and the last letter, the Lamed and the Bet, joining them together, he showed you how that could spell two different words, Baal and Lev, don't and heart, and took that as a message that this entirety of the Torah, beginning with that Bet and ending with that Lamed, needs to be done with all your heart. And that requires restraint from turning to the right, and restraint from turning to the left, which would lead you to either detract from the Torah or add to the Torah. Rather, we should approach the Torah in its pure original entirety, and that way we can be committed to it with our entire heart. So this would serve as an example of the uniqueness of Rabbi Levi Yitzchak's scholarship, of seeing the common thread throughout and combining the halachic idea where we don't add or detract the mitzvah to the homiletical interpretation of mixing the letters together and shuffling around those words and taking that as a message for life and how we should be approaching the Torah. Now, Rabbi Levi Yitzchak didn't just ask us or teach us that we should be strong and committed and restrain ourselves from changing or veering from the Torah and thereby serve God, dedicate ourselves to the Torah with our entire heart. He actually did so in practice. And by his example and by his unwavering commitment, he was able to inspire others in the same way. In fact, we're going to see a one-of-a-kind story where in a moment of true self-sacrifice and really putting himself on the line, he was able to bring back a Jew who had turned communist, who had turned traitor to his people, to bring him back to commitment to the Jewish people in the most astonishing of ways, to really express how every Jew can approach the Torah with his entire heart, no matter how distant he's become. This was a theme that the Rebbe, his son, really expressed throughout his life and throughout his life's work, that every Jew has that goodness inside of him, and every Jew has that potential to be reconnected to the Torah. Let's see it in this fascinating story, which is also what we will conclude with.
Mr. Israel Adamski lived in Dnipropetrovsk, Ukraine. In the 1930s, he attended underground Torah classes taught by the Rebbe's father, Rabbi Levi Yitzchak Schneerson.
Семья Рава, вся семья жила на втором этаже. Первый этаж был такой полуподвальный, второй этаж они занимали. А на третьем этаже жил человек, который был управляющим этого дома, коммунист, еврей, но который, между прочим, на которого возлагалось следить за рабом, следить и докладывать вышестоящие органы. Короче говоря, вот он такую роль играл. И вот однажды однажды было такое вот дело. Значит, в семью Рава пришла женщина и сказала, что я хочу, чтобы моя дочка вышла замуж, значит, чтобы у нее была свадьба только по-еврейски. Чтобы была хупа, чтобы все как полагается было. Ну, Рав говорит, давайте ее сюда. Привели ее и тут же поставили хупу. Но нужны были свидетели. Кто-то, нужно были еще люди. Да? Людей не хватало. И тогда Рав говорит, я знаю, кого пригласить. Давайте пригласим вот этого самого Хаима, который живет в... Ну, все удивились, потому что знали, что Хаим ведет себя не так, как прилично, неприлично. Он говорит, давайте его позовем. Его позвали, он принимал участие в этой свадьбе. Потом Рав с ним говорил, беседовал. И он ему признался, Рав и так знал, он ему признался, что он вот, за ним следит и так далее, он коммунист. И в следующую субботу он пришел в синагогу. Это было тогда, когда синагог уже было очень мало. На весь город 2. Одна помещалась на улице Фрунзенской, а другая, там дальше Литейная такая улица была в центре. Там помещалась. И все прихожане синагоги знали так друг друга. И вдруг среди них появился вот этот человек. И он сказал очень громко, прошу меня не бояться. Я такой же еврей, как вы. Игбенаид, этот коммунист потом стал активистом. Да? Активистом, ну знаете, активистом за то, чтобы еврей остался евреем. Понимаете?
So definitely an illustration of how far we can go if we have the commitment. As Rabbi Levi Yitzchak showed, he was going to stop at nothing to make sure this couple had a Jewish wedding, and he needed a minyan. He needed the 10th one to complete the minyan. So he went and got that 10th one from wherever it may have been, even the most unlikely source. And that turned out, that commitment and that spirit of self-sacrifice actually brought that individual back from, instead of being a troublemaker and part of the communist problem, he became, as we saw, a Jewish activist. So let this serve as inspiration for all of us that no matter what comes our way, no matter the times that we're in and the challenges they present, we can hold steadfast. We can do things the Jewish way. We can rise above those challenges and find the sense of commitment, the sense of dedication, no matter what, and God will help us to prevail. With that, I think we're going to conclude. I would like to show you, however, the course that we will be beginning on Thursday. Thursday, we will start a new course on the coming of Mashiach. And here we go. No. Let's try one more time. Here we are. The days are coming is all you want to know about the Mashiach and the redemption. We're going to start this Thursday and continue for 5 Thursdays, talking about what does the Jewish belief in the coming of Mashiach really mean? Is something going to explode? Is someone going to fall out of the sky and change the world? What is actually going to happen? And how do we expect it to work? 5 lessons for all you want to know about Mashiach and the redemption, particularly the process for how that takes place. What's going to be unique about this class is we're going to reopen. And that means we're going to be doing this class both in person and here on Zoom. I'm going to teach this on the deck behind the synagogue on Saunders Road. For those who feel comfortable to attend in person, we'll be doing that social distance outside, without every chair 6 feet apart, and etc. But we will have the opportunity to see each other and actually have the class together. At the same time, the class will be broadcast here on Zoom and on the same Facebook and YouTube channels for those who are unable to actually come and join us. So I hope you will join us in one form or another. Please do let me know if you intend to join, and we will see you then. Meanwhile, I'm going to stop the live stream